introduce Lord Avebury to you, and I would request Lord Avebury to say, because I believe, sir, that the very purpose, the focus of your visit to Pakistan is to talk about Kashmir, to express your views and to listen to the people.
Well, can I first of all say how delighted I am to be back in Pakistan after an absence of just over 3 years, I think, and to have come at a time which is of crucial importance for the issue I'd like to discuss with you in a few minutes' time, the question of Kashmir. And I say that because you've just hosted in Islamabad the talks at foreign minister level, foreign secretary level, which produced the declaration on the future programme of work that they intend to undertake. And also, just now you had the visit of Mr. Erik Avebury, who is the new minister in our Foreign Office who deals with the affairs of this region, and who replaced Liam Fox, who is his opposite number in the Conservative government which lost office on May the 1st. So we have a new start in Great Britain. We have a government which is committed to human rights. As you will have seen, Robin Cook, the Foreign Secretary, in his mission statement at the beginning of his term of office, set out in the individual policies for particular questions and regions, including that of Kashmir. And I think you will have seen from the statements that were made by Erik Avebury when he was here that Britain is now fully committed to doing whatever it can to arrive at a solution of this long-standing problem, which restores the human rights of the people of Kashmir and which gives a political settlement that's fully in accordance with the wishes of those people and which are to be established. So whilst I don't think one should read too much into this, in the sense that you can't expect a solution to be reached in a few months' time just because the two parties have said they will put it on the agenda. It is a major step forward nonetheless, and it creates an atmosphere in which harmony and progress can be accomplished. Now what has to be done? What are the confidence building measures which were spoken of in this communique? And that has to be defined, and I think that friends of India, friends of Pakistan, and indeed friends of peace in the whole region have the right to express their own opinions on what confidence building measures are most likely to produce a result that the people of Kashmir would accept. And first of all, I'd like to mention the proposal by Nawaz Sharif that Kashmir be demilitarized, that the level of forces in the country should be greatly human rights violations. The human rights violations take place by very reason of the fact that you have 700,000 armed groups which they finance, and be a very good chance that at least the problem will be alleviated. But the second thing I want to enter a plea for is far greater transparency than we have at the moment. I do believe that the United Nations rapporteurs on extrajudicial executions, on torture, the working groups on arbitrary detention and on disappearances should be invited to visit the territory, and they have asked numerous times to be given an invitation so that they can come and make their assessments for themselves and report back to the Human Rights Commission.
Basement full of papers and files.
True.
Where you kept following all the incidents that were reported.
And you were in the barbecue.
That's right, I was in the barbecue.
Dr. Niazi.
Dr. Niazi, he's here. He suffered a heart attack, but he's doing all right. He's living right here in Islamabad. If you have time, maybe you'd like to see him. I could give the number for Dr. Niazi starting. Iqbal, you want
He's a nice guy.
very nice. You have his number, so you could write it down and give it. Dr. Niazi is here. And I don't know whether
I'm sorry you had a heart attack.
Yeah, it's a very bad one. He had to go to Texas, then it's okay now.
But he's not that old, is he?
But I don't know, when you cross 40, everybody's young. When you're 20, everybody's old.
Well, what is 20 years older than you are? That's what I'm kind of. Yes.
But you are here in Pakistan in connection with...
Oh, it went well. It went well, because we had no one.
The journey was excellent. Thank you so much.
We actually were getting a visit in March. Bajwa told me that you are coming in March and May.
Anyway, it's good to be with you now, after some time.
Yeah.
You will be, you will spend 1 day. Nice, pleasant. Yeah,
I'm looking forward to it.
and you are going back on 28?
On Saturday.
28?
Yeah.
I know it's too
It's a
short.
short day. Very short. No problem. You can get back. You need to stay. Not season. August, September is ideal. It's a good season.
कश्मीर आप लोग आजाद कराएं अगर आप कश्मीर को आप लोग आजाद करवा लें मैं तो कश्मीरी नहीं मैं बहुत काम करता और दुनिया में मेरे बच्चे कहते रहते हैं कि शायद अब आप एक उसका डायरेक्ट होगा कश्मीर आजाद होगा कहता मैं एक दफा भी जाऊंगा श्रीनगर में हमने पैदल आप साथ होंगे आप अच्छा आप आगे बड़े
And Siachen is about 18,000.
Has been set down for just a minute, Eric. Within the working groups on a list of subsidiary headings, some of which, of course, like Siachen, are very closely related to the main issues. Now, I was delighted. Exchanges across the airwaves and through the media. At last there is a meeting at the personal level which will enable the participants to understand each other's ways of thinking, and one hopes to make progress at last with the substantive issues which have been avoided for so long. If we look at it with the benefit of hindsight, we might, from the rest of the world, was resting entirely on hope, and that similarly this agreement relies critically on the support of the rest of the world, the continued support of organisations to which the two states belong, such as the Commonwealth and the United Nations, and your friends in the Commonwealth, such as the United Kingdom in particular, to make sure that we do everything that we can to ensure that this process is a success. And I was delighted that our Minister at the Foreign Office, Erik Avebury, and I noted that he made the offer on behalf of the United Kingdom, Mr. Douglas Hurst, as Foreign Secretary. He also said that the United Kingdom stood ready to make available any services that were found to be useful by either of the parties. But that required that both India and Pakistan would want us to do that. We have no right to muscle in on the process, but we thought we had something to contribute, and I believe that we still do. And I hope that as a result of Mr. Thatcher's offer, which lies upon the table, in these discussions, these sort of continuing deliberations, because whether or not you take the advice, which may be on offer, which takes place in September. My anxiety about this process, I must say, is that it may take a very long time, because if the papers are presented in September and then the foreign secretaries have to go away and react to them, and then they have to consider the further question, which is, and that's why I think it's important for people not to be lulled into a sense of security that this process has to be a continuous and progressive one. They have to imagine that there will be setbacks along the way, and that both parties and the Kashmiri people themselves have got to exercise a tremendous amount of patience if they're going to have the outcome which is acceptable to the people of Jammu and Kashmir. How then is that participation of the people to be measured? Is this the $64 question, or do the confidence building measures come first? I took it, and I may have been quite wrong, that the confidence building measures that were mentioned in the first heading were mainly to do with Jammu and Kashmir, but I understand that other people read them as being more generally applicable to the relations between India and Pakistan. But I think there are confidence building measures which could be initiated at an early stage in the process. I mentioned at other gatherings that where we've been talking about the problem, that the demilitarization of Jammu and Kashmir would obviously be of crucial importance, because all the human rights violations that we see occurring in the Indian part of the territory are committed either by the armed forces or by their auxiliaries, the militant groups which are financed and armed by the security forces. So I think that if there was a reduction or even a withdrawal to barracks of the armed forces in the Indian part of the territory, that would immediately result in the kind of diminution of human rights violations that must be an essential component of any successful process. Because you can't discuss a business deal with somebody in one room while in another he has a gang of thugs beating up your children. That's what it amounts to if we're saying that there must be amicable and progressive discussions at the foreign secretary level, while the killings, the rapes, the looting, the arson goes on in Jammu and Kashmir at the rate that we see it occurring. And so I think the withdrawal of the military forces is priority number one. The second confidence building measure that I personally would very much like to see is greater transparency by the Indians, and I mean that they should admit the rapporteurs on torture and on extrajudicial executions, and the working groups on arbitrary detention and on disappearances, to carry out their assessment of the position in Jammu and Kashmir so that they can report back to the Human Rights Commission. There may be some very unpalatable things that they have to say to the Indians if they are allowed in, and similarly with Amnesty International, who've been promised an invitation to visit the territory for well over a year, but are still waiting for the authorities to say when it's going to be convenient for them to come. Yes, the Indians will have to sustain very severe criticism, but they do at the moment. The information on the human rights violations is all there. You can see it in the reports of Amnesty International, of Human Rights Watch Asia, and now, of course, on the internet, which I think is the greatest tool for human rights which we have available in the world today, because it's impossible for anybody to control it. And the only snag, as far as Jammu and Kashmir is concerned, is that as long as you have to rely solely on the accounts which are placed on the web by individuals or NGOs operating within the territory, and you can't actually go there, then there's the problem of verification. And that's why I say they must admit Amnesty International. They must.
I wish to thank all of you, and in particular Lord Avebury, for his very sincere efforts for the last 4 or 5 years to help the Kashmiri people. One thing I would like to say, that I was in New York in 1948, when the resolutions were passed by the Security Council or the Commission, it was definitely laid down in the ceasefire agreement which was signed by India and Pakistan both, that there will be a vote taken in Kashmir as to whether the people want to join Pakistan or India. One is really surprised, at least I am really surprised at how it came about that India started saying that it's a two-tongue of India. But it was Jawaharlal Nehru himself who stated so categorically in 1948 and later on also that is a matter which the people will have to decide. It's the right of the people to decide. And now they started saying that it is an inseparable part of India, a two-tongue of India. How it became a two-tongue, one doesn't know. Now anybody can produce to say that it became a part of India. It never became a part of India, nor it became a part of Pakistan. Let us say it this way. So we have had negotiations regarding the armies had to withdraw. The ceasefire agreement says that the Indian army will withdraw the bulk of it, and Pakistan army will withdraw the whole of it. But that discussion has been going on for the last 50 years, so they could never agree. But how the armies have to go on. Now, during the last 5 or 6 years, the people have occupied Kashmir, butchered and killed in this struggle. In this age, when a people can put in sacrifices to such an extent that 50,000 people, including men and children, have been butchered by 700,000 armies of India. What justification could there be of it goes primarily, I think, to our Prime Minister? That he very sincerely, I don't know how, but we convinced India, the Prime Minister of India, that they should have a dialogue. We have had dialogue before, in a dialogue, in a friendly manner, so that it is settled and all other problems are settled. In this age, when Indian people, sir, the Indian people live in a state of miserable poverty. In a city of Calcutta, people are living in the streets. A country which has millions of people who are living a miserable life in poverty, how can they afford to have a superpower, armament, an army, a navy, an air force? How can they afford to do that? And in any case, even if they could afford to do that, against who? Against China? Or against Pakistan? Or against Burma? Or against Indonesia? India is trying to build the leadership in Asia by suppressing the people, the rights of the Kashmiri people. And they have butchered people, they have suppressed people, and they have tried to get them on their side. They have not been able to do it the last 50 years or so. So it's a welcome sign that India and Pakistan have agreed to have a dialogue around the table, and they have agreed that they are going to have committees to pursue these matters itemized. And if they succeed, we'll be very lucky. But I hope that they will succeed. In fact, the fact of the matter is that we are not the gainers in this dialogue. India has gained because of Siachen. Because Siachen is a difficult problem for India. It is not for us. So let us hope that even if Siachen or otherwise, that both parties, both countries come together, settle the problem. But the basic fact should always remain in the minds of the people all over the world. And it is the Kashmiri people who consider, who must be considered and must be made a party to any agreement about the future of the state. Sir, whatever you are doing, or whatever our chairman, our parliament, Kashmir Committee chairman will do, we are all grateful to you. We are most grateful to you. I am
President of Jammu and Kashmir, because there was a dinner by the Senate chairman in which the Maldivian speaker.
I heard that the Maldivian parliamentary delegation was here because they were following on my heels.
On most of the calls.
So how did they get on? That was
See, we have a sort of special relationship with the Maldives Parliament, because when I was a speaker, we funded the construction of their parliament. And recently, in May, we were there, the Prime Minister and myself, and they were falling short of funds. So we had to give them further funds for the furnishings and completion. Hopefully by November, it will be ready. I think we'll send a delegation to let's witness the opening ceremony there.
So you were at one time speaker yourself?
Well, like whether I was in the army or a speaker, I'm not a lord, I'm a Khan.
The same thing.
Same thing.
To see you, no doubt, when he was here. Was it last year?
2 years.
2 years ago.
Because he was in one of our cavalry regiments. He went and paid them a visit. He's been coming to Pakistan.
He's always very regardful. So I'd like to tell you that you'll always be welcome in Pakistan. Well, I have been welcome, and it's been so far a most magnificent visit. As usual, you try to get in as much as possible within a very short space of time. But we have met a number of people and spoken about the problems of Kashmir. I've already done one television program, spoken at a public seminar, and this afternoon we're going to Rawalakot. So I think we're going to Rawalakot this afternoon.
I'm very grateful to you for the interest that you are taking in this matter, and I feel that despite the fact that we have started bilateral talks with India, and we've had them in the past.
So you don't expect too much from them?
But you don't expect too much from them. And this morning you must have noticed
I did. I read the newspaper report.
So it's really going to be the same thing all over again. So it's really some sort of, I would say that if the other country, the international community, starts taking interest in this matter, one because of the historical connection with India and Pakistan. And also I feel that your voice is heard with a lot of respect in India and Pakistan. So when something emanates from the United Kingdom, your parliament, or from your leaders, it is heard with a lot of respect, and it has an influence. And even I would say that other countries, when it comes to India and Pakistan, that's the European countries,
they certainly defer to UK's experience.
and you have a lot of experience dealing from the United Kingdom leaders and parliament.
And what the issues are.
What the issues are, and they seem to understand it better. We also feel more comfortable talking to you about these matters. So I think that if you keep taking interest, if let's say this matter is raised in the British Parliament, if people keep talking about it, keep pressing, maybe there will be some movement. And movement on this issue would really mean peace for more than 1 billion people of this earth.
I think we're pushing as a visit you made overseas. And those are all optimistic signs from our point of view that Britain will take a more active role. I've got one like that.
Made of brass wool and very done on and that was
गोरा देखी फिल्म तो कितना चुके बड़ा
mind. But I will attempt to rise to the challenge which Mr. Rawalakot has just posed, to maintain the solidarity with the Kashmiri people for as long as I live. And I'd also like to echo the remarks that have been made by Mr. Rawalakot about my good friend, Mr. Naseem Bajwa, of Friends of Pakistan, who has been my kind host and most agreeable companion now on my third visit to Pakistan and Azad Kashmir, and without whose generous assistance these trips would not have been possible. And through him, I think we tap a much larger source of support in the Pakistani community in England, which has always stood firm behind the Kashmiri cause. And so I'm delighted also to be associated personally with Friends of Pakistan. And when we go back from this trip, we will be reporting to them on our findings. Our deliberations will cover the subjects that have been mentioned, the talks at senior level between the foreign secretaries, the reaction to them, and of course the recent visit of our minister, Erik Avebury, who is here in New Delhi just a short while ago. Now, let me say about the joint statement that I find it, to begin with, encouraging in that it at least defines the list of issues which they're going to address, and saying that their common objective is to discover ways of promoting friendly and harmonious relationships between India and Pakistan. And if that's to be the paramount consideration when they do get down to detail, then it should be possible to find the solutions to all these problems and to sustain a comprehensive and constructive dialogue between the two countries on any residual problems which still remain. And you will have noticed that the foreign secretaries themselves have covered the two most important questions, that is, peace and security coupled with confidence-building measures, and the key issue of Jammu and Kashmir, whilst they only monitor the working groups which are to be established under the other 6 headings. Now, I think that everybody who's a friend of Pakistan and India, and who's a friend of the Kashmiri people, must welcome these moves and look forward to with keen interest to the next round of talks in September. But since both sides had already elaborated their position before these discussions, we know what they are, we know where they start from, and it should be possible to see already where the main problems arise, which you could identify from the public statements of the past years on Jammu and Kashmir, and we must regretfully say that so far no way has been found of narrowing the gap, and this seems to be confirmed by the latest statement which was made by the Indian Foreign Secretary before the ink was even dry on the declaration. We know from many years past that the Indians take the view that the constitutional status of the part of Jammu and Kashmir which they occupy was finally settled when the Constituent Assembly convened in 1951 declared 5 years later that the state was an integral part of the Indian Union. And that language is still being echoed today by Mr. Gujral. Whilst, of course, Pakistan says that the Security Council resolutions of 1940s and 1950s remain extant, as indeed they do, because it's a fact in international law that any resolution which has been passed by the Security Council remains in force until the Security Council itself either amends or rescinds it. And the pretense that the similar agreement has in some way modified or cancelled the resolutions of the Security Council is not a sustainable proposition. No agreement made between two countries, no treaty can override the decisions of the Security Council, which of course are supreme and lie above any national bilateral agreements or even multilateral agreements. Now, the other disappointing part of the statement, I thought, was that the foreign secretaries didn't mention the Kashmiri people themselves. Well, I must add that I'm sure this doesn't indicate any weakening of Pakistan's commitment to a solution which conforms with UN principles, including, for example, the Declaration on the Granting of Independence, Declaring Countries and Peoples in 1960, and its companion of the same year, which says that decisions of this kind have to be made by plebiscite or by the vote of an assembly freely and fairly elected on the basis of universal adult franchise. When Douglas Hurd was UK Foreign Secretary, you may remember this, Mr. Khan, because I think I sent you copies of the letters, he was asked about UN declarations on Kashmir, and he avoided giving an answer by saying that things had moved on since then, and that was 50 years ago. Now things have moved on indeed since 1947, but they moved in the direction of greater democracy rather than less. And all the trends in the world in the last few years, the liberation of subject states from communism, the liberation of South Africa from apartheid, all these things, and the eastern growth of democracy in Eastern Europe, they've all reinforced the concept of democracy rather than weakened it. And so things have indeed moved on since 1947, in that the rights which ought to have been conferred on the Kashmiri people in 1947 have now been codified in international law and have got to be applied in any solution of that problem. Now I want to mention our own government's policy on Kashmir, and to remind you that the previous Foreign Secretary stated that our policy was based on three pillars: the improvement of human rights, a genuine democratic process, and an end to foreign support for militant action. Now, unfortunately, one is not able to say that there has been any change in the human rights situation in the valley, according to the reports that we get every single day. And thanks to modern technology, there is now a constant flow of information coming out about the killings, the rapes, the arbitrary arrests, and the disappearances, which are, as I say, a daily occurrence. I noted, for instance, that on June the 18th, the Bar Association of the Jammu and Kashmir High Court expressed deep concern about the increase in human rights violations they said were being perpetrated by the Indian forces and the Special Operations Group of the J&K Police. Then in another statement, the Hurriyat leaders Abdul Ghani Lone and Mohammed Yassin Malik listed extrajudicial killings, demolition of houses and looting as among the means being used to try to break the will of the people. Some of the atrocities are the work of these irregular units, which are armed and financed by the Indian authorities with the collaboration of Farooq Abdullah's administration. I must say that I think it's virtually impossible to imagine how the talks can be brought to a successful conclusion while this kind of atrocity continues. I mean, if you are trying to drive a bargain with somebody in one room of your house and in the next room his thugs are molesting and raping your family, then you're not very likely to arrive at a good business conclusion with him. And that is a fair analogy, I think. The Indians and the world community demands that India and Pakistan get down to unbiased and genuine discussion of the problems that remain. But as a precondition of that, I would suggest that these questions of human rights have to be addressed, and have to be addressed as a preliminary to any substantive discussion of the issues that have been listed. According to the Kashmir Times, the security forces are now attacking women on a large scale, something that's never happened in the past. They gave a number of instances, including one of a young girl who was tortured with cigarette burns, and another where the security forces raided a house in which there was only a widow and her daughter. No adult male was present. And as you know, you'll have seen, the Bar Association appealed to the international community to use their good offices to end this spate of human rights violations. No doubt, those who get to speak to the Indian authorities, such as our Minister Erik Avebury, do emphasise the concern which is felt in our own countries, and particularly in Britain, with its community of 350,000 Kashmiris, from many of whom, by the way, I bring you greeting, particularly from Zafar Khan and Zafar Sharif, to both of whom I spoke just before I left. So there is hope of a wider political détente, but that can only be achieved if we solve first the human rights problem. And I don't think it would be right to expect that the international community should soft pedal their criticism of the violations just because these talks are underway, and particularly if they feel that they've got a role to play mediating between the parties. I would suggest that, on the contrary, the prospect for successful negotiations are severely impaired by this daily catalogue of horror stories that we're receiving. And it must be an essential precondition of these successful talks, if they are to be successful, that the Indians begin to treat the Muslims of the valley as human beings. I was very glad to note that the distinguished Indian filmmaker and human rights activist Tapan Bose was in Srinagar last week, and that he was preparing for a team of observers which will arrive in the state, I think at the end of this week, isn't it? Because whilst the outside world may ignore the mayhem in Kashmir, partly because only what is seen on our television screens becomes a reality to us, and there aren't any journalists making that kind of program on the question of Kashmir at the moment. But since we haven't got the advantage of overseas television crews being present at the Commission of Human Rights Violations, the next best thing is that the Indians, who after all have another axe to grind, do witness the events for themselves, that they report that to the Indian public and through them to the world at large. So I think people would pay a lot of attention to Tapan Bose, particularly if he films the interviews with witnesses that he meets during the course of his visit. I think that the international community would listen to Amnesty International, which is why that human rights organisation is still waiting for an invitation that was extended in principle by New Delhi last year, but which has never been carried into fruition because the moment is never quite right for this visit to take place. I think they would listen, the international community would listen carefully to the UN Rapporteur on Torture, Dr. Nigel Rodley, or UN Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Executions, Monsieur Bakr Wali Ndiaye, who has asked now for on three separate occasions, 3 separate years, whether he could be invited to visit Srinagar, and on every occasion he has been turned away by the Indian authorities. The statement by the 2 foreign ministers refers to confidence-building measures, and I believe that nothing could be more helpful in creating confidence than total transparency, and maybe Pakistan could set an example in this by opening her own doors to the UN rapporteurs and working groups and to Amnesty International. They might have some criticism to make, as they always do, of what happens in Pakistan, but this would be as nothing to the tremendous moral advantage that Pakistan would then possess in bringing additional pressure to bear on the Indians, that they would admit these agents of the UN Human Rights Commission. And speaking of human rights commissions, I would draw your attention to the work of the Indian National Human Rights Commission, which has repeated now 3 times that they have demanded or asked for amendment of the Protection of Human Rights Act 1993, under which they were brought into existence, so as to remove what they call ambiguities and impediments in the Act. And that means, of course, to put it in plain English, that they're not allowed to investigate the atrocities committed by the security forces, and they're not allowed to take witness statements from people in Kashmir who are claiming to have had their human rights violations. And when the Human Rights Commission did look at events in Kashmir, such as the appalling massacre of Beach Bihara, in which 50 people were murdered by the Indian security forces, they did so on the basis of statements that were made to them by the authorities, and not by taking statements from the witnesses as Justice Bahauddin Farooqi had done, and he had some 72 witnesses, if I remember rightly, who would have been available if the National Human Rights Commission had had the power to listen to them. You may remember that Yassin Malik ended his hunger strike in May on the basis of assurances by the Indian Home Minister that complaints of violations of human rights of the people of Jammu and Kashmir will be investigated by the appropriate agency and action taken against the guilty. And I wrote to Mr. Gujral, the Indian Prime Minister, asking if that meant that his government were now prepared to implement the NHRC advice. I also asked him how the public would get to know that action had been taken against the guilty when the few trials which do occur of members of the security forces are always held in camera and the judgments, as you know, are not published. And I said to the Indian Prime Minister that the statistical summary gave no idea of whether the sentences were commensurate with the offences in question. But I thought that the 272 convictions which are said to have been recorded against the security forces in respect of human rights violations appeared to be a tiny figure in relation to the vast array of allegations made by NGOs and individuals. And I mentioned, for example, the murder of human rights activist Jalil al-Rabi as a remarkable case. I think it was unique in the sense that when the police team investigated the murder, they did find that a named person had committed it. That was, as you recall, one Major Avtar Singh, an Indian Army officer. But then at the time it was reported that Major Singh had been removed from service last year, and he wasn't to be found at the address that was given by the Army authorities. I also mentioned another example to the Indian Prime Minister. That was of a crime where the perpetrators ought to have been very easy to identify. The alleged rape of 9 women by army personnel at a place called Bawusa Ragres during the night of April 22-23. In that case, eyewitnesses said that the offence had been committed by soldiers from the Rashtriya Rifles who were based at Rawalakot, and so inquiries could have been made of the commanding officer of that base, and I'm sure it wouldn't have been very difficult to discover which particular soldiers were on duty on the night of April 22 and 23 and to have had them questioned. And there are hundreds of cases of a similar nature where abundant evidence did exist, probably isn't anymore, and yet no prosecution ensued. And finally, I did ask Mr. Gujral whether the Parliamentary Human Rights Group, of which I was still chairman, I've just stepped down, and after the 21 years you may think I need to hand over to somebody else. But since the election, I've become vice chairman of the group, and the new chairman is Anne Clwyd MP, who I'm sure we'll do our best to persuade to come and visit this area of the world and to look into the Kashmir problem herself. But I must say, this has given me, in parenthesis, the opportunity of taking on another commitment in Parliament, that is the vice chairmanship of the Kashmir group under Roger Godsiff, who's also a group representative. Anyway, I asked Mr. Gujral whether the Parliamentary Human Rights Group would be allowed to send 2 members to the Valley on a fact-finding mission. And this is about the 10th time I've asked that question. I've never had a reply up till now, but I thought that with a change of government in India there might be some hope of relaxation. And I'm sorry to tell you that I was mistaken. But so far he hasn't replied, and I think after 6 weeks he's unlikely to do so. May I now turn to the question of how the Kashmiri people are going to participate in the discussion on their own future, which are supposed to be held following the meeting of the Indian and Pakistani foreign secretaries. There is, I suggest at present, no means of ascertaining what is the opinion of Kashmiris as a whole on any particular subject, because they're divided by the local equivalent of the Iron Curtain. There can be no political party which operates freely on both sides of this divide, no media circulating across the barrier, and evaluating the events in each part of it. No Nelson Mandela, who can appeal to every section of the Kashmiri people, in whatever part of the state they live. But even if there wasn't this physical impossibility of a unified movement like the ANC in South Africa or the PLO in Palestine, there's the political impossibility that it would be allowed to articulate the aspirations of the Kashmiri people. The elections which were held in the Indian part of Kashmir last year, to which reference has already been made, were, I'm sorry to say, seen by the Tory government in our country as forming part of what they always referred to as a genuine political process, which they've been urging for some time on the parties. And they couldn't understand what I think is the rather simple proposition that if candidates seeking to present a viewpoint or viewpoints held by the majority of the electors were unable to stand, then the process couldn't be described as either genuine or democratic. And I'd like to draw your attention to what I believe to be quite an instructive analogy, and that was where elections were held in a territory whose characteristics I'll just describe to you, and you can tell me what it is before I give you the answer. This was a territory in which 85% came under martial law. It was a territory in which the armed opposition alleged that 4,000 people were being detained without trial. It was a territory in which curfews covered most of the land, and that these curfews were imposed under emergency legislation. It was a territory in which martial law allowed the authorities to arrest anyone breaking curfew, and the curfew breakers were liable to be shot. The national armed struggle had been going on for 7 years, and the average death toll daily over that period was 16.3 people. Any answers? It's not Kashmir. That's Rhodesia. That was Rhodesia in 1979. And you may remember that Bishop, what is now Zimbabwe, Bishop Abel Muzorewa won the election in 1979 with 67% of the vote. And the reason for that was because neither of the two wings of the Patriotic Front, which were led by Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe, contested the election. And that was in turn because they disagreed with the constitutional arrangements under which it was being fought. And you remember also that the following year, when the arrangements were changed by the Lancaster House Agreement, the two nationalists won an overwhelming majority, and Bishop Abel Muzorewa disappeared into some black hole of history from which he's never emerged since. So you would think that that parallel might have occurred to some people, and you'd also think that it was obvious enough that if Farooq Abdullah needs 750,000 armed men to keep him in office, that he can't be said to represent his people in any proper sense of the word. But I have to tell you that in Britain, and I think perhaps even more so in the United States, there's a tendency to accept the results of badly flawed elections and to invest the holder of office as a result of those elections with a spurious legitimacy. And I can see this process beginning with Farooq Abdullah. People say, oh, well, we've got to talk to him, he's there, he did win the elections. Now, if Farooq Abdullah is not to be seated at the conference table, then who is, and how should the participants be chosen? That, I think, is the $64 question. The Hurriyat Conference may be seen to command a higher level of support amongst the people, but they don't represent everyone, even in the valley, and they make no claim to speak to the people of Jammu or Ladakh. In any case, we're talking about, I assume they're talking about the whole state, and not just the Indian-held part of it, and some uniform means of selection has to be applied in every part of the state if the representatives are to be genuine and to carry with them the confidence of the people. And the only fair way I know of doing this is through the ballot box. And whether people choose representatives to speak for them at any meeting between India and Pakistan to determine their constitutional status, that would be, in effect, if they were chosen by ballot for such a purpose, a referendum. And so it doesn't seem at all likely that India would go down such a route. And yet they have the difficult task of proposing some plausible alternative means of giving the Kashmiris a say in their own future. Kashmir is accepted universally, and I think this is true amongst the international community, who will be the subject of very strong pressure on the Indians that you've got to find some way of bringing the Kashmiris in, then how are you going to do it if you don't believe in elections? And Mr. Chairman, those that I know are